Hey, it's Mike here, and today, when coffee is healthy and when it isn't healthy. To be completely transparent, I just wanted to know why I'm a little weakling when it comes to consuming coffee, and so I did a deep dive in the research. You could say that I was on that research grind, pun shamelessly intended, and on those grounds, if you would like to roast me, go right ahead in the comments. And the result is research on a bunch of different topics. We're talking about just general cardiovascular outcomes that are good or bad for different groups, as well as just genetic effects. I will even be cracking open my own gene data to see where I land there. Who is getting the positive effects here? Who's getting the negative effects here when it comes to things like sleep and heart disease? We're also going to be looking at dementia and mental health in terms of anxiety, for example, and we have a little hack that could potentially help take that anxiety edge off for those who get that. So let's just go. Really fast, I just want to say that I'm not a coffee hater and I'm not a coffee addict, so I'm just going to give it to you unbiased, no skin in the game here. But in terms of my story here, I got a little bit jealous of all y'all coffee drinkers. You know, I have a randomly high tolerance to other substances, wink, but I don't have a high tolerance to coffee. And you know, coffee is the #1 antioxidant consumed in the US and globally, and we have various studies showing that it lowers risk of mortality, for example. We'll get into that data a bit later on, but I was like, man, I want to get in on this. But when I drink it, I don't actually get more energy. I just find myself awake, like writing musicals in my head at 4 a.m. that I always forget. So I jealously looked through the research, but yeah, I want to start with how it's a stimulant and what the pros and cons of that are when it is good and when it is bad. Starting with how it stimulates you, as you probably know, coffee blocks adenosine, which is what makes us sleepy, and that's how it can just knock the fatigue right out of our body. But it also does some other things. It increases dopamine receptor activity, and it also increases norepinephrine, aka adrenaline. And that's how it can result in giving people some anxiety on occasion, which we will get to in a little bit. But let's start with the positive stuff. The first benefit of it being a stimulant is a behavioral change that I believe plays a role in why it is associated from studies like this one with lower cardiovascular disease risk, oftentimes like 30% lower cardiovascular mortality for coffee drinkers. ADD tangent, that same study also found that you get more of a benefit drinking it in the morning than later in the day. That sort of makes sense, but bringing us to that behavioral change, it has to do with steps. Yes, this randomized, unique crossover trial tracked steps, but the participants were randomly texted whether to drink coffee or not each day for 2 weeks, and they found that the same people during the coffee period walked 1,000 more steps per day on average, which is quite a lot, especially when you consider that the average American might be floating somewhere around 4,000 steps, so that could be like a 25% increase. And as they say, that extra 1,000 steps would be associated with a 6 to 15% reduction in mortality, an effect size similar to some of the mortality gains we see in coffee drinkers. This is really fascinating to me because those coffee drinkers ended up walking 1,000 more, and were they consciously deciding to do that? You know, where is free will here? Because I'm pretty sure it was just a chemical response that led them to just run off like little Energizer bunnies. But another positive aspect could have to do with cognition. We'll get more into dementia and stuff like that later on, but just in terms of it being a stimulant, it just accelerates the rate at which you think to an extent, which is pretty fascinating that it can just straight up increase reaction times and processing speed. Like in this study on people who play esports like League of Legends, having faster aiming and faster results naming, you know, the actual color of mismatched color names, aka a Stroop test. But getting to the cons, could there maybe be some negative to like thinking way too much and way too fast? Oh yeah, that is called anxiety, which I will say, if I've drank a lot, I will occasionally have a little bit of spice of anxiety from coffee, but there's of course people who have more severe reactions. And from this study, for some who are prone to it, it can even induce panic attacks, especially at higher doses. Higher doses of 5 cups worth of caffeine also increased anxiety in, quote, healthy people, defined as no panic disorder. Whoops. But this is where I want to be presenting solutions as well, and I'm really excited to try this in the future, but I recently found a study in which adding l-theanine, which is the active ingredient in green tea, to a drink with caffeine, it wasn't coffee, but I think the principle still applies, actually lowered the anxiety effect of that caffeine. And this makes a lot of sense because previous studies have found that l-theanine actually induced a meditative-like brainwave pattern. So yeah, 100 milligrams of that to a caffeinated drink. I'm gonna try it in the future. But since we're talking about mental health, I figured I should just swing it back in the positive direction, the pro direction here, because both tea and coffee have positive effects for depression from this study. We're talking about those who had 2 or more cups a day had a 32% lower prevalence of depression for coffee compared to non-coffee drinkers. So it's news like that that makes me sad as somebody that can't drink a lot of coffee. Were they sad that they weren't getting some of the health benefits? That's probably what they were picking up in that study. Anyway, we can move on to another sort of con or a risk here that has to do with just an interesting biological response to drinking caffeine. It's a stimulant again. It's also literally a drug, which we like to forget. So when we're talking about that adrenaline release, we're talking about a little bit of a fight or flight thing going on. So that means that your heart rate can increase, and then you can also get a little bit of vasoconstriction from that effect. But additionally, you can also get vasoconstriction because that adenosine is actually a vasodilator. So as you block that, you'll have less artery dilation, and that can lower blood flow to certain areas. And as a result, that can increase blood pressure. We can get to a cardiologist comment to Cleveland Clinic saying that a morning cup of coffee can potentially raise your blood pressure by up to 10 points, which might be enough to push it in a potentially risky range, really. All right, now for a quick break with what I seriously believe has changed my life for the better, and that is Cove Pure, today's sponsor. Let's check it out. And I have a fun test for you guys, so stay tuned. This is Cove Pure, which is a tabletop water purifier that has reverse osmosis, does hot water, which is amazing for things like ramen or tea, as well as cold water. And Cove Pure eliminates up to 99.99% of impurities in your water, including PFAS or forever chemicals, which disrupt hormones, which is really not good. And unfiltered water is a major source. And today I have an interesting one for you guys. We're gonna test chlorine levels before and after purification. All right, step one, I'm gonna purify some water in here, get it going, and we're gonna fill up some of my tappy water. And the jars have the same amount of water, so let's try the chlorine detection kit. And now we're gonna mix. Oh, I think we're starting to already see. Oh my gosh. Why am I drinking pee my whole life? You guys, this is actually ridiculous and explains why I can smell, taste everything of the chlorine in my water. All right, guys, bottoms up. If you would like to try it, you can of course click the link below or scan the QR code right here on screen for $200 off. All right, let's get back to the video. So we have a particular situation here where we have no risk for a certain group and more of a risk for another, and that is from this American Heart Association study. For people who had grade 2 to 3 hypertension, drinking 2 or 3 cups a day essentially doubled the risk of cardiovascular mortality. Ouch. You might remember, I just mentioned a study where there was 30% lower risk of cardiovascular mortality for the average person, but we can start to see where a certain slice of the population can have an increased risk when they drink coffee. And the other levels of coffee didn't have a statistically significant difference in cardiovascular disease mortality. And this is where that l-theanine from green tea comes in as well, because as this study found, it can blunt that blood pressure increase after caffeine consumption. We have another con here. I'm not trying to just string a bunch of negatives together, but these are just related to the same topic, so just stay tuned for more positive news. But this has to do with, again, as I was mentioning, that lowering in blood flow. We can actually see from this study, a 250 milligram dose of caffeine, which is quite large. Practically, that's between a grande and a venti from your local coffee shop, not unheard of in one sitting, has been shown to reduce resting brain blood flow by between 22 and 30%. I do not want a 30%, potentially nearly a third drop in blood flow through my brain. However, that's likely transient. And it also appears that as people drink more coffee, they might build up a resistance to that. And one hint of that is that when people go off coffee who are regular drinkers, they get withdrawals. And part of that withdrawal might actually be too much vasodilation from that adenosine, which could lead to headaches. But yeah, this 2009 study found that in habitual caffeine consumers, cerebral blood flow increases significantly 12 to 24 hours after withdrawal. So were they not getting the blood flow the whole time and then they just got it again for the first time? I think we need more studies on that. And so there is a concern with the cerebral blood flow, but I know it's kind of scary sounding, so I'm just gonna jump right ahead and say that multiple meta-analyses find between a 10 and 20% reduction in all-cause mortality with coffee consumption, peaking at around 3 cups per day. All right, now that we've lowered your adrenaline, maybe, depending on how much coffee you've drank, we can go ahead and say that the concern for lower brain blood flow here is these white matter issues, in particular, white matter hyperintensities that signify damage, possibly, again, from a lack of blood flow. The study found that, quote, our findings suggest that prolonged high coffee consumption may be associated with the risk of white matter hyperintensities in late life. So for older people, maybe not getting enough blood flow is leading to some issues. And another interesting issue here, just from a 2025 study out of Ecuador, which has to do with blood flow potentially, they found an association between coffee drinking just as a habit and lower back pain. Now, if you've been following my videos for a while, you might know that I covered lower back pain in terms of spinal disc degeneration driven by a lack of blood flow to your lumbar discs, your lower back discs, which really don't have blood flow directly into them. They just have nutrients diffuse there. So if you have atherosclerosis, that gets blocked, major issue. So I'd love to see more studies on that. Are coffee drinkers getting less blood flow to their lower back? We don't know. While we're on the topic of the cardiovascular system, I just wanted to highlight one group that might really benefit from drinking coffee. And that brings me to this American Heart Association study that found that in people who had survived heart attacks, they previously had a heart attack, higher coffee consumption defined as 2 or more cups of coffee per day resulted in a 40% lower risk of mortality in general. And so I just have to remind people, main source of antioxidants, sadly, shows how few plants people are eating, but that's the result. And of course, if you're getting those antioxidants in your bloodstream, you're lowering inflammation in your arterial wall potentially. And so people who have had a previous heart attack very likely have heart disease throughout those arteries. So if they can just be bathed in more antioxidants from coffee constantly throughout the day, then they're probably going to see lower risk. All right, now I want to get into sort of long-term brain diseases. I think it's just really interesting that we're getting mixed signals here because we have that potential lower blood flow, we have that increased cognitive performance, but then let's look at dementia and Alzheimer's. And so for dementia, from this meta-analysis, we're not really seeing the needle move in either direction. The risk remains more or less flat. But for Alzheimer's risk, which I'm personally concerned about based off my family history, we can see that the highest coffee consumers had nearly a 30% lower risk of Alzheimer's. I'm really curious about what confounding factors that are here. Again, are these people that are retiring later, continuing to drink coffee so they can go to work and be productive? I'm not sure. And while that is a larger, higher quality study, it is worth mentioning that one study found that 6 or more cups of coffee a day was associated with a 50% higher risk of being diagnosed with dementia. So, maybe don't go too hard. And really interestingly, that was also the case for caffeinated and decaffeinated coffee. I don't know. But then it made me wonder, is this actually causality, or were they just forgetting that they drank coffee already and then just drinking cup after cup after cup? But the gene conversation continues here because it's really important in terms of how well you process that caffeine, because the CYP1A2 gene variants determine the half-life of caffeine in your body, how long it lasts in your body, because it determines how much of a liver enzyme that you create that breaks down caffeine. And this is really unfortunate because pretty much across the board, we see negative effects for caffeine for people with the wrong combination of this gene. For example, from this JAMA study, slow caffeine metabolizers consuming 2 or more cups of coffee per day had 2 times increased heart attack risk. That sucks. We also see in terms of sleep studies that they do way freaking worse, and people who have more of the gene combinations that can metabolize caffeine, they have absolutely no effect negatively on their sleep. So this got me thinking, what are my actual DNA results? I have my DNA text file, and so I went in and just searched it. And so what you're looking for here is the RS7625551 gene and its combinations. And I found, to my surprise, that I'm actually an AC combination, which is an intermediate metabolizer. I'm not a great metabolizer, and I'm not a horrible metabolizer, which I thought I was. So as an AC, it's got me thinking AC, DC, AC, and dark roast coffee. Let's go. Also, the ADORA2A gene is even more strongly connected to sleep, and I was also mixed on one of those readings that I was able to see. All right, now I want to sort of rapid fire some secondary health areas that aren't talked about as much in the area of coffee. And the first one has to do with the acid reflux myth. More or less, about 40% of people believe that coffee causes acid reflux, but despite mixed results from the literature, more often than not, we're seeing absolutely no association in the epidemiology. All right, now we have type 2 diabetes. Could there be an effect here? Antioxidants are great. Well, from this study, an increase of daily coffee consumption by greater than 1 cup was associated with an 11% lower relative risk of type 2 diabetes. Anyway, going on to obesity, we have some mixed results here. It's really interesting. So we have one randomized controlled trial that gave people with obesity coffee, and they found that it actually lowered their fat and increased their muscle more than placebo. I'm like, what's even going on here? Maybe it's an inflammatory pathway thing. But then we had another one that gave people with obesity coffee, and it actually increased their desire to eat more sugar throughout the day. So, jury might still be out on this one. It's also not going to be healthy when coffee isn't just coffee. Adding that saturated fat-laden cream or cow's milk did actually mitigate the benefits of coffee mortality-wise. And then we have the gut microbiome here. This could be an entire video, but perhaps the most interesting recent, I think 2025 discovery was that Lawsonobacter, a Saccharolyticus, which was recently discovered, so I'm allowed to butcher the pronunciation of, was higher in people that drank coffee regardless of like where in the world they were from. And we have very little data on this bacteria, but it appears to be healthy. It appears to be a butyrate producer, which is a very healthy short chain fatty acid. And then it also might play a role in gut barrier integrity from this preprint, but that's maybe a little bit speculative. But yeah, in the end, we're looking at coffee on average, probably lowering mortality risk between 10 and 20% just on a population level. But then we got to get a little bit more specific. Are you somebody who has the wrong genes here? Are you somebody who has super high blood pressure? Are you somebody who is really old and has a high Alzheimer's risk and is chugging 6+ a day? There's certain little zones that aren't so fun to be in. But I also just find this research to be absolutely fascinating. 1,000 more steps per day, like that's a fact that just made me think of everybody that drinks coffee a little bit differently. Like they just go into the coffee shop and then they're all just sort of cranked up, gonna get some extra steps, hopefully lower cardiovascular disease that way, and of course through those antioxidants as the main source in the diet. But again, twice the risk of heart disease if you don't have the right caffeine metabolism genes. Like that just blows my mind. And yeah, I'm gonna try getting some l-theanine and scoop about 100 milligrams of it into my coffee and see if I feel anything different. Maybe that's a good idea for a follow-up video. Let me know down below. And of course, if you would like to try Cove Pure, get some of that awesome, pure, also delicious water. Did I even mention that before? I don't think I did. You can, of course, scan this QR code and get $200 off, or just click that link below. So yeah, other than that, let me know if there are any awesome coffee facts or studies that I did not include. It's a massive body of research. And of course, feel free to like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.